I'm Laurence Llewelyn-Bowen, and you are very welcome to another tour of my mind palace, where we get to talk about the history, the culture, and the alchemy of interior design. This time we have a very special guest, the Duke of Doomed Decadence himself, Aubrey Beardsley. So I've got a message to anyone out there who dismisses Aubrey Beardsley's work as being overheated, as being puerile, as dandified, onanistic nonsense. Yeah, great. That's actually the point of it. Most art rather just sits there on a gallery wall, passive, waiting for you to bring it alive, to activate it with your interest. But Beardsley isn't like that. His once seen, never forgotten images are mind worms that burrow deep. Finally, after 40 years of on-off Beardsley veneration, I've actually worked out that he got every bit as turned on by what he drew as he was drawing it as I get from looking at it. And 120 years later, that's extraordinary. That immediacy, that ability to communicate, and yes, that realization that in fact we are, or at least I am, every bit as kinky as he was. There's very little of Beardsley's own voice that has come down to us, so it's just as well his work is so goddamn loquacious. There is one last-ditch pleading letter he sent to his publisher a few months before he died. In it, he begs for all his unnatural erotica to be destroyed. It wasn't. It was making Leonard Smithers far too much money for that. During his ridiculously brief working life, 1892 to 1897, when he died at 26, what he did is very well documented, but what he thought isn't, which actually works perfectly. I'd much rather listen to his drawings. He was a congenital consumptive with the most transparent health imaginable, which, of course, immediately creates this rather tragic aura and makes you think of heavy drapes to keep the sunlight out and towers of silken cushions, of occasional spatters of negligently mopped up lung blood, and a lot of time on his own listening to his own rackety breathing. Yes, all of that. And in fact, all of that at that particular time was absolutely the height of fashion. Decadence and doom was the D&G of its day. But the reality wasn't actually quite so exotic. His posh mother entered a mésalliance with a wastrel after Beardsley's natural father died at 40 of the tuberculosis that would kill his son. The family's social standing nosedived, and Aubrey and big sister Mabel ended up in a scruffy terraced villa in Brighton. Delicate Aubrey was bullied by step-papa into taking various clerking jobs. This hideous, Cratchit-esque existence galvanised him into badgering pre-eminent pre-Raphaelite Sir Edward Burne-Jones with his portfolio. Ned Jones, the name he grew up with in Birmingham, saw a lot of talent in Beardsley's juvenile medievalism, and with the nightly artistic night on his side, our Aubrey cleared out his desk at the office and embarked on his first artistic commission: illustrations for a luxury edition of Mallory's Morte d'Arthur. Book illustration, back then, was having a heyday. Despite the modern printing technologies of photogravure and the intricate skill of the Victorian steel engraver, the book-buying public had a voracious appetite for art editions that featured preciously conceived woodblock-esque double-page spreads and coordinating vignettes at the top of the chapter. Now, there's something very lucky about Beardsley's timing. He may have had a tragically doomed and painful life, but in the short time he had, he always seemed to be in the right place at the right time. If he'd been born 10 years later, his intensely contemporary genius would have been frittered away in the pursuit of the super-fashionable cubism, born 10 years earlier, and he'd have been smothered by the heavy oiliness of pre-Raphaelitism. No, for Beardsley, the 1890s were a sweet spot. It is just astonishing that Aubrey Beardsley squeezes an entire creative evolution into 5 years, with barely an artistic bum note, unless it's actually a bum. With this in mind, it's no surprise he bored of conventional medievalism quickly, keen to move on artistically. Halfway through Mort d'Arthur, everything starts to get a little bit naughty, sneakily, subversively at first, and then flagrantly stylized. And it's all because he fell in love with Japanese woodblock prints. These were a relative novelty in Victorian collections. The flattened shapes, off-centre yet balanced compositions, and blocks of strong pattern start to contaminate Beardsley's more cosy, more William Morris-inspired figures, swaying whiplashes of vegetation and kimono-like triangles of flattened pattern invade the arts and crafts idylls. It sets the tone for his next big stylistic leap. After a trip to Paris, Aubrey comes back to his drawing board with a passion for Henri Toulouse-Lautrec. Lautrec's disability, like Beardsley's TB, restricted him from participating with any great energy in the world that surrounded him. And just like Beardsley, it turned him into an incisive artistic voyeur. It's voyeurism that inspires Lautrec's strange, often low viewpoints. Beardsley loved these sniper-ish angles, but he also loved the modernity he found in Lautrec's lithographs. Overnight, he throws off period detail and creates instead a bizarre, graphic dream world that's inhabited by super-sexualized figures who float through bold, abstracted shapes. And then, to make it all kind of literally surreal, Beardsley includes elements of mundane detail, a Venetian blind or a late Victorian dressing table. He created the perfect visual world to accompany Oscar Wilde's tortuously decadent retelling, in fancy French, of the Salome, Herod, John the Baptist lust triangle. The verse and the pictures shocked in equal measure and drove the conventional majority puce with disapproval. Disapproval that converted to vengeful rage when Oscar Wilde was found guilty of sodomy and sentenced to hard labour for the maximum penalty allowed. All of which threw a black spotlight of notoriety onto Oscar's frankly weird-looking super dandy buddy, Aubrey Beardsley. And the Beardsley brand was made. He became patron saint and then the ultimate juvenile martyr of the cult of decadence. A cult that seeped from the naughty 1890s right through the seedier decades of the 20th century up to the live fast, die young, smoke pot and shag anything 1960s. But were Oscar and Aubrey ever an item? See, I don't really think so. I've known the Beardsley erotic canon for a long time now, and it's definitely an omnisexual rather than a homosexual cavalcade of licentiousness. There is, however, a reoccurring pornographic type. And she is very much a she. Sturdy to the point of beefy, you get the feeling that outside Beardsley world, she'd have been a ferocious opponent on the lacrosse pitch. She's also often been compared to Aubrey's big, literally, sister Mabel. She became quite a well-known Edwardian actress. Inevitably, within the cult of Beardsley, a place of constant conspiracy theory, Mabel has become deified as Aubrey's paramour, the sister lover that posed for his pen and then dipped his ink. Onto the rigorous, taut lines of Salome, Beardsley's style starts to blossom with a more rounded fruitfulness, and for me, it's his finest hour. He lets in acutely observed details of modern life and then kind of puts them in a blender, which was already stuffed with Baroque ornament and is now highly literate Japonism. And then He whirs up an extraordinarily original style-rich smoothie, as punchy and as immediate as a stop sign. The work of this middle period commands the eye with the most authoritative draftsmanship yet. Asked to illustrate a no-holds-barred, hardcore edition of Lysistrata by Aristophanes, his knowledge of Japanese art provided Beardsley with the perfect precedent. Shunga woodblocks and their faintly comical but nonetheless mouth-wateringly compelling sexuality provided him with the genitals, whilst Watteau gave him the period detail. You can tell that Aubrey loved Lysistrata, a woman in charge. She was a woman on top. Life starts getting harder for Aubrey. He's hemorrhaging more and more. He starts to get scared, and facing the reality of an early death literally in the face, he converts to Roman Catholicism. It's a very showy conversion. Out go the erotic etchings, and in come the altarpieces chez Beardsley. His interior decoration rhymes perfectly with his contrition. But he just can't seem to get rid of the naughty from his work. Sure, there isn't any overt nudity or actual naughty bits anymore, but underneath all of those engrossingly intricate Rococo revival patterns, you just know there's a whole load of sin waiting to plop out the minute it gets the chance, the minute someone turns their back. So, Aubrey, well, he dies on the Riviera at Menton, on the run from his perpetual hemorrhaging and his sins. Sins that, despite his pleading letter to Leonard Smithers, remained out there in bookshops and on magazine shelves, tittling all and influencing many. The school of Beardsley really gets going quite quickly. Charles Ricketts, a member of the book illustration Old Guard, absorbed Beardsley's skeletal layouts and sinuous lines for his turn to illustrate Wilde's Salome. Lacking the young master's brinkmanship, he kind of dodges scandal by amping up the arts and craftiness. But thanks to Beardsley's influence, the work of Charles Ricketts gains a new originality, a new power that eases its passage seamlessly into the first decade of the 20th century. The Beardsley baton is then passed on to this extraordinary creature. Baron Hans Henning van Watt ran away to the circus and trained as a mime. Just look at those jazz hands. Turning his back on his aristocratic German childhood, he changed his name to Alistair, and after studying philosophy threw himself into the Beardsley style with a decadent, hungry gusto. He gives the style a scrawny muscularity, basing all of the figures, whatsoever their gender, on his own lovely self. And with little graphic context or much in the way of background, all the drama is played out in the tortured physiognomy and the contorted skull-like faces of the characters. Taking the Beardsley influence into the 1920s, Irish illustrator Harry Clarke was, like Aubrey, tubercular. Clarke's graphic world leans heavily on Beardsley's late Baroque, with microcosmic patterns that slide in and out of conscious recognizability. It's a world of trippy detail. His greatest hour for me dawns as he brings the dark, dank, pessimistic world of Edgar Allan Poe to black and white Gothic life. These days, Clarke's artistic reputation comes largely from the stained glass that he spread thickly over the churchscape of his native island. You find yourself having to give his waif saints in their richly ornamental outfits the benefit of the doubt. Is that a look of pure holiness or impure horniness? It's often difficult to know. Arte, Art Deco's graphic big brand hitter, drank deep from the Beardsley wellspring of inspiration. To the swaying lines and gurning faces of Aubrey's feisty females, Erte, or Remainder Tritoff, as he was known on his birth certificate, adds a skipload of Vegas drag. He also colours it all in, bringing Aubrey onto the main stage at the Crazy Horse, high-kicking and draped in pearls, but wearing little else beside a squirt of Chanel No. 5. But it's in the 1960s that Aubrey Beardsley's artistic tomb gets thoroughly raided and the long-dead dandy properly resurrected. As an antidote to all of that irritating post-war optimism that kept the 50s calm and carrying on, the mid-60s fancied some seriously naughty aesthetic necrophilia, as you do. And Aubrey was perfect, doomed, decadent, and forever young, with Art Nouveau lines that were recognisable from 100 paces. The 1966 exhibition of his work broke box office records, particularly after it got raided by the Vice Squad and exhibits were taken into custody. The Obscene Publications Act of the time forbade the depiction of the male member at an angle more acute than, wait for it, the Mull of Kintyre. Yes, really. So Aubrey's gigantic, priapic satires became a scandal that blasted the name Beardsley across the country's consciousness. Stylistically, his work rhymes perfectly with the way the 60s swung. The Beatles returned to him again and again. The cover of Revolver, the styling of their animated film Yellow Submarine. And actually, Aubrey himself is included into the personal cultural pantheon that Peter Blake cut out and kept to make the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band collage. Whilst creating the Bieber brand, Barbara Hulanicki indulged her love of Beardsley and channeled him in her graphics and textile prints, as well as using the dark side decadence of fin de siècle decorating as an inspiration for her shop interiors. Aubrey Beardsley hit pop culture with a squelch. A hard squelch. Sexy, dirty, naughty, and excitingly shocking. And above all, the one thing this new generation of the 60s worshipped in the, let's face it, porn of their grandparents was its super, super stylishness. Yes, I've got to admit it, I do to this day. Yes, it's rude. Yes, it's immoral. No, it's not healthy. And yes, if you do it enough, it may well affect your eyesight. But the whiplash lines of Aubrey Beardsley will be forever far, far sexier than the reality of ordinary mortal sexing. So now we've got ourselves so thoroughly overexcited aesthetically, I suggest the coldest of cold showers.